The first snow fell on the very same morning Charlotte Doyle decided she was not going to die in Harlan Creek, Wyoming territory. And the irony of that was not lost on her, even as she stood shivering in the doorway of the only general store the town possessed, her carpetbag clutched against her chest like a shield against everything the world had already done to her. It was November of 1878, and Harlan Creek sat at the edge of nowhere with its back to a mountain range that didn't care whether anyone survived the season. The town had 12 buildings if you counted the livery stable and the outhouse behind the saloon, which Charlotte did not. She had come from St. Louis on a series of stagecoaches and buckboard wagons that had taken 11 days and stripped away any remaining romanticism she might have held about the frontier. The advertisement she had answered in the Missouri Gazette had promised a respectable position as a school teacher in a growing Wyoming community. What greeted her was a mud street, a hand-painted sign that read Harlan Creek in letters that had begun to peel, and a wind that cut through her wool traveling coat like it had a personal grievance. The man who ran the general store was named Elias Pudge, and he was not at all pleased to see her. "We already got a school teacher," he said, not looking up from the crate of tinned goods he was inventorying. Charlotte set her carpetbag down on the counter with a firmness that made him look up. "The letter you sent said the position was available as of October 1st. Benson Fitch took it in October 2nd. Benson Fitch," she repeated. "He drinks some, but he knows his arithmetic." Charlotte looked around the store. It smelled of sawdust and salt pork, and something she couldn't identify that was probably mold. Through the front window she could see the snow beginning to collect in the wheel ruts of the street outside, and she felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had spent the last of her savings on the journey here. She had nothing to go back to. Her mother had died in July. The boarding house in St. Louis had already rented her room. "Do you know of any other positions available in town?" she asked, and she was proud of the steadiness in her voice. Elias Pudge scratched the back of his neck. "Me saloon sometimes needs a girl who can, something other than that," Charlotte said. He looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a man trying to decide how much trouble a woman was going to cause him. "You could ask Monroe Haskins," he said finally. "He owns the Rafter H spread about 4 miles northeast of town. His housekeeper quit in September and he's been making a mess of things ever since. But I'll warn you right now, Miss Doyle. Miss Doyle, Monroe Haskins is not an easy man." She picked up her carpetbag. "I haven't met an easy man yet, Mr. Pudge. Where exactly is northeast?" The road to the Rafter H was barely a road at all. It was more of a suggestion that had been worn into the frozen earth by wagon wheels and cattle drives, and Charlotte walked it with her carpetbag banging against her knee and the snow falling steadily thicker around her. She had asked Elias Pudge if she could borrow a horse, and he had looked at her like she had asked to borrow his soul. So she walked. The mountains rose to the northwest in great white-shouldered walls, and the sky had that peculiar pewter color that meant the snow wasn't finished with her yet. She smelled the Rafter H before she saw it, wood smoke and cattle and the sharp, clean scent of hay. Then the ranch came into view around a stand of cottonwood trees that had gone winter bare, their white branches reaching up against the gray sky like outstretched hands. The main house was larger than she expected, built of good squared logs with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. There were outbuildings beyond it, a proper barn, a bunkhouse with a thin thread of smoke rising from its chimney, several corrals where horses stood with their heads down against the weather. Charlotte stood at the gate and looked at it for a moment. Then she walked up to the porch and knocked on the door. Nothing happened for long enough that she knocked again, harder. The door opened, and Monroe Haskins stood in it, and Charlotte's first thought was that he was younger than she had expected. Elias Pudge had described him as if he were some weathered old curmudgeon, but the man in the doorway couldn't have been much past 32 or 33. He was tall, with the kind of broad shoulders that came from genuine work rather than vanity, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up despite the cold, his dark hair overlong and in need of cutting, his jaw carrying several days of dark stubble. He had eyes the color of good creek water, a clear gray-green, and they were looking at her with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Mr. Haskins," she said. "Who are you?" he said, not rudely exactly but without ceremony. "My name is Charlotte Doyle. I'm told you need a housekeeper." He looked at her carpetbag. He looked at the snow collecting on her hat. He looked at the road behind her, apparently searching for whatever conveyance she had arrived in, and found nothing. "Did you walk here?" he said. "I did. From town." "Yes. In this weather." "The weather was improving when I started," Charlotte said, which was not entirely true. "Mr. Haskins, I'm a capable woman with excellent references that I can produce if needed. I can cook, clean, keep accounts, and I have some experience tending livestock in a pinch. I won't ask for much pay to start because I understand that's the nature of starting somewhere new, but I will need a place to sleep tonight that isn't outdoors." Monroe Haskins stared at her for another long moment. Something moved behind those gray-green eyes that she couldn't read. Then he stepped back from the door. "Coming out of the snow," he said. The inside of the Rafter H house was, as Elias Pudge had promised, a mess. Not a hopeless mess, Charlotte noticed with the practiced eye of a woman who had been keeping house since she was 11 years old, but a bachelor mess, the kind that accumulated when a capable person simply ran out of time and attention for anything that wasn't urgent. There were dishes that needed washing, a floor that needed sweeping, a pile of mending in the corner that had been growing long enough to develop its own geography. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, which was encouraging. The fireplace in the main room was drawing well and putting out real heat, which was more than encouraging. It was immediately wonderful. Monroe watched her take in the state of the house with an expression she would later learn was his version of embarrassment, which looked on him like a slight tightening around the jaw and a fixed gaze somewhere past her left shoulder. "I have 2 ranch hands in the bunkhouse," he said, "Pete Garrity and Cy Walsh. They eat supper at the main house. That was always the arrangement. Breakfast they manage themselves. I'll need you to cook supper for all of us, keep the house in order," and he paused. "That's probably enough to start with." "What will you pay?" Charlotte asked. He named a figure. It was modest but fair and included room and board. "I'll take it," she said. "Where do I sleep?" He showed her to a small room off the kitchen, which had clearly been the housekeeper's room for some time based on the cheerful curtains that still hung in the window, white cotton printed with small blue flowers. There was a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a hook on the wall for clothes. It was cold because it was away from the main fire, but there was a small iron stove in the corner and a coal bucket beside it that was still half full. "Thank you," she said, setting her carpetbag on the bed. Monroe Haskins stood in the doorway of the small room with his arms folded across his chest, looking at her with that unreadable expression again. "You really came all the way out here for the teaching job," he said. "I did, and they'd already filled it." They had. "That's a long way to travel for nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Charlotte said. "It led me here." She said it matter-of-factly, not flirtatiously, and she turned to unpack her bag before she could see what expression crossed his face at that. The first week was mostly logistics. Charlotte learned the rhythms of the Rafter H with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, which was the kind of attention that some people found comforting and others found unsettling. Monroe Haskins, she determined, was in the unsettled camp, at least at first. He had built his entire ranch operation around himself as the single organizing principle, and having someone else impose order on the domestic half of it seemed to throw him slightly off balance. Pete Garrity and Cy Walsh, on the other hand, were delighted. Pete was a red-faced Irishman in his 40s who had worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana and had the stories to prove it. Cy was younger, maybe 25, quiet and methodical and darkly handsome in a way he seemed completely unaware of. Both of them treated Charlotte with a courtesy that was almost old-fashioned, which she appreciated. The first supper she cooked at the Rafter H was nothing special, salt pork and potatoes and cornbread, because that was what was available in the kitchen. But she made the cornbread right, which meant she made it in a cast iron skillet with a proper amount of butter. And when Monroe Haskins took his first bite, he got very still for a moment in a way she had already started to recognize. "My mother made it like this," he said, without looking up from his plate. She didn't say anything to that because there was nothing to say. She just passed the salt. Over the following days, as November deepened and the cold settled in properly, Charlotte began to understand why the position of housekeeper at the Rafter H had been filled and vacated several times over. Monroe Haskins was not a cruel man. He was not even, she came to understand, a difficult man in the way that some men were difficult, with meanness or volatility or the expectation that a woman should be grateful for the privilege of working herself to the bone. He was difficult in the way that solitary people were difficult, the ones who had arranged their inner lives so precisely around their own company that the presence of anyone else felt like a disruption to something they couldn't entirely name. He worked from before sunrise to after dark. He didn't talk much. He ate what she put in front of him without complaint and sometimes without seeming to taste it. He paid her on the first of every month in crisp bills that he produced from a lockbox in his office, with the kind of ceremony that suggested money was a serious thing and ought to be treated as such. What he did not do, at first, was engage with her as a person. She was a function of the household, same as the cook stove or the water pump. She understood that. She even appreciated the clarity of it in her way because clarity was easier to navigate than pretense. But then, about 2 weeks in, something shifted. It was a Sunday evening, and the snow outside was coming down in the earnest, serious way it did when it had decided to make a statement. Pete and Cy had eaten and gone back to the bunkhouse. Charlotte was sitting at the kitchen table by the lamplight, writing a letter to an old friend in St. Louis, when Monroe came in from outside still wearing his coat, knocking snow from his boots on the mat. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she kept on the back of the stove, and instead of taking it to his office the way he usually did, he sat down across the table from her. She kept writing. He drank his coffee. After about 5 minutes he said, "What are you writing?" "A letter," she said. "To who?" "An old friend." She paused. "Her name is Frances. We grew up together in St. Louis." "You miss it?" "St. Louis?" Charlotte considered the question honestly. "I miss Frances," she said. "I don't miss much else." He turned the coffee cup in his hands, a gesture she would come to know well, the slow rotation that meant he was thinking about something. "Why'd you leave?" She set down her pen. "My mother died in July. After that there wasn't much holding me there. I answered the advertisement for the teaching position because," she paused, choosing her words, "because I've always wanted to do something that mattered. Teaching seemed like that." "And what does keeping a ranch house seem like?" he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite mockery but was watching to see how she'd respond. "It seems like surviving the winter," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "Which is more important than it sounds when it's your first winter in Wyoming territory." Something moved in those gray-green eyes, not quite a smile, but the country near one. "Harlan Creek winters are no joke," he said. "It'll get worse before it gets better." "I'm not afraid of worse," Charlotte said, picking up her pen. He sat there for another quarter-hour, drinking his coffee and not saying much else, and when he finally went to his office she found herself oddly reluctant for the quiet to return, which was a feeling she stored away carefully, the way you stored things you weren't sure what to do with yet. December arrived with a ferocity that even Pete Garrity, who had wintered in Montana, found impressive. The thermometer outside the kitchen window showed readings that made Charlotte's eyes water just looking at them. The cattle had to be checked twice daily, water troughs broken free of ice, hay distributed before it froze solid. Monroe was out in it from before dawn, and Charlotte took to keeping a pot of something hot on the stove at all times, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had seen what men looked like when they came in from that cold, and she knew that a hot cup of soup or coffee could be the difference between a person holding together and a person falling apart. Monroe noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly, But one morning she came down to find that the stove had already been lit, and a neat stack of extra wood had been brought in from outside and stacked beside the kitchen door, which was not something that had been anyone's job before. She stood and looked at that wood for a long moment. Then she started breakfast. The incident with the fence happened on a Thursday in mid-December, when the temperature had dropped so low that the air itself seemed to splinter, and Monroe came in at midday with his face tight and white with cold and something else, something edged with frustration and fatigue that he was containing by the thinnest of margins. "The north fence line is down," he said, pulling off his gloves with hands that shook slightly. "Cattle are drifting into the McAllister pasture. I need Pete and Cy to ride out with me after we eat." "Sit down," Charlotte said. He looked at her. "Sit down and eat something first. You're half frozen and you'll make mistakes if you go back out there without eating. 15 minutes won't lose you the cattle." For a moment she thought he was going to argue. The line of his jaw went hard. Then something in him relented, the way a tight rope relents when you give it the right kind of slack, and he pulled out a chair and sat down. She put beef stew in front of him, thick and still steaming, and bread she had baked that morning, and he ate it with a focus that suggested he hadn't eaten since before dawn, which she suspected was true. The color came back into his face. The shaking in his hands subsided. "The north pasture fence goes down every December," he said after a while. "The cold contracts the wire, and then if there's any wind load on the posts, they just give." "Can you set the posts differently? Deeper, or with something to brace them against the contraction?" He looked at her with the expression he used when she surprised him, which was happening more often now. "Maybe," he said. "I've been thinking about using a stone base on the corner posts. Costs more going in, but it'd hold better." "It sounds like it would pay for itself in a couple of winters," she said. "It would," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment, turning his bread over in his hands. "Where'd you learn to think about things like that? Fence posts and stone bases?" "My father had a farm in Indiana before we moved to St. Louis," she said. "He was a practical man. He always said that the expensive solution was almost always cheaper in the long run than fixing the cheap solution over and over." Monroe's expression shifted into something softer and more complicated. "My father said something like that too," he said. "Different words, but the same idea." "Where is your father now?" she asked, because the way he said it suggested past tense. "Buried on the East Ridge," Monroe said. 7 years ago. He built this ranch with his own hands starting in '68 after the war. When he died, he left it to me, and I've been trying to be worthy of it ever since." He said this without self-pity, just as a fact, the way you might state the altitude of a mountain. It was simply the terrain of his life. Charlotte looked at him for a moment. "You have a beautiful ranch," she said. "He would be proud of it." Monroe looked at her, and this time the thing in his eyes was not quite contained. It wasn't the almost smile of before. It was something rawer, something that hadn't expected to be seen. He looked away quickly toward the window where snow was falling again in the patient, relentless way of a Wyoming December. "I better get Pete and Cy," he said, pushing back from the table. "Take your gloves," she said. "The lined ones, not the work gloves." He paused at the kitchen door, his back to her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was something in those 2 words that made her heart do something she had not given it permission to do. Christmas at the Rafter H was, by Charlotte's deliberate effort, a proper Christmas. She found a small spruce tree at the edge of the cottonwood stand and enlisted Cy Walsh to help her drag it to the house. She made paper decorations because she had no glass ones, and strung cranberries because she had a jar of them in the pantry. She made a proper Christmas dinner with a roasted chicken, because a turkey was beyond what Harlan Creek's general store could provide, and a dried apple pie from a recipe her mother had given her, and gingerbread with molasses because she'd found a good tin of the spice at the back of the pantry shelf. She did not know if Monroe Haskins celebrated Christmas or cared about it. She did it for herself, partly, because she needed the anchor of familiar things in this strange new place. And she did it for Pete and Cy, who were far from whatever families they had left somewhere behind them. And then she found, when Monroe came in from the evening chores and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of the lit spruce tree and the smell of gingerbread filling the house, that she had done it for him too, without entirely realizing it. He stood there for a long moment with snow on his coat and his hat in his hands, and the firelight from the hearth caught the expression on his face and turned it into something that Charlotte felt in her chest like a struck chord. "My mother always had a tree," he said quietly. "Mine too," Charlotte said. Pete Garrity sang 2 Irish carols after dinner with more enthusiasm than pitch, and Cy Walsh taught Charlotte how to play a card game his grandmother had taught him, and Monroe sat at the end of the table and didn't say much, but he stayed, which was its own kind of statement. He stayed until nearly 10 o'clock, which was 3 hours later than he usually lingered after supper, and when he finally said goodnight and went toward his room, he paused at the kitchen door and looked back at Charlotte, who was clearing the last of the dishes. "It's a good tree," he said. She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Haskins." Something crossed his face at the formality of it. "Monroe," he said. "You can call me Monroe." "Monroe," she agreed, and felt the shape of his name in her mouth like something that had always been there, just waiting for permission. January arrived and made December look like a preliminary. The cold that settled over the Wyoming territory in the early weeks of 1879 was the kind of cold that rewrote your understanding of what temperature could mean. The thermometer outside the kitchen window stopped being a useful instrument because it only went so low, and the mercury was pressed against the bottom of the glass with the desperation of a trapped thing. The snow was no longer falling so much as existing, an ambient constant presence that the wind moved from one place to another without ever actually leaving. Monroe told Charlotte that she did not need to go outside in weather like this, and she agreed to that for approximately 4 days. And then on the 5th day, she put on every layer she had, borrowed an extra coat from the hook by the back door that she suspected had belonged to Monroe's mother, and went out to help Cy with the horse feeding because she had looked out the kitchen window and seen that Cy was doing it alone, which meant Pete was unwell. And one person could not properly manage 12 horses in 40 below conditions. When Monroe came back from checking the cattle and found her in the barn with Cy breaking ice from the water trough with a mallet, he stopped in the barn doorway, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen before. It wasn't anger. It was closer to something that preceded worry, the emotion before the emotion, like the first note before a piece of music. "What are you doing out here?" he said. "Pete's got a fever," she said, not stopping her work. "Cy can't do this alone." "I would have come to help when I got back from the south pasture. You weren't back yet," she said. He stood there for a moment, and then he came and took the mallet from her without a word and finished breaking the ice himself. And she went and checked on the horses' water buckets, and they worked beside each other in the cold barn with their breath making clouds, and something about that felt so right and so natural that Charlotte had to look away from him and focus very hard on the task at hand. She went back inside before him to check on Pete, who had a genuine fever that she treated with willow bark tea and strict orders to stay in his bunk and drink water. Monroe came in an hour later and stood at the kitchen doorway watching her take a cool cloth off Pete's forehead and replace it with a fresh one. "You know about nursing," he said. "My mother was sick for a long time before she died," Charlotte said. "You learn what you can." Monroe leaned against the doorframe with his arms folded, watching her work with an expression she couldn't fully read from where she was sitting, but she could feel it. That evening, after Pete was settled and Cy had gone to the bunkhouse, Monroe sat across from her at the kitchen table again, which had become their unspoken custom in the evenings. But tonight, there was something different about it. He had a glass of whiskey in front of him, which he sipped slowly, and he was watching her with the kind of attention that made her aware of the particular way the lamplight fell across the room. "How old are you?" he asked, which was not the question she had expected. 26, she said. "And you?" 32. He turned the glass in his hands. "Do you plan to stay in Wyoming after the winter?" The question hung in the cold kitchen air. Charlotte looked at him steadily. That depends on whether there's a reason to. Monroe Haskins looked at her for a long moment that stretched out long enough to make her heart rate do something irregular. Then he said, "There might be," and picked up his glass and didn't say anything else for several minutes. But there it was. There it was between them now, real and warm as the fire in the kitchen stove, impossible to pretend away. The telling moment came on a Friday night toward the end of January, when a wind came down out of the mountains with such violence that it rattled every window in the house and sent drafts hissing through the gaps around the door frames. Charlotte had been up since before dawn doing laundry, the physical effort of which in a Wyoming winter was its own kind of heroism, and by evening she was tired in the deep-bone way that went past exhaustion into something almost philosophical. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching the lamp flame bend in the draft, when she heard Monroe come in from the back porch. He came into the kitchen already peeling off his coat and stopped when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" he said immediately. She looked up, surprised that he had read her so clearly. "Nothing's wrong," she said. "I'm just tired." He hung his coat on the peg and came to the table and sat down not across from her, as was their habit, but in the chair beside her, which was different enough from their usual arrangement that she noticed it with her whole body. "Tired different than usual," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at her teacup. "Sometimes I miss my mother," she said. It's not a sad thing exactly anymore. It's more like a habit. She died in July and it's been 6 months, and sometimes there's a specific moment when I think, I should tell her about this, and then I remember." Monroe was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind threw itself against the side of the house with something that sounded almost personal. "After my father died," he said, "I kept making him coffee in the mornings for almost a month. I'd pour 2 cups before I remembered." Charlotte looked at him. He was looking at his hands on the table, those capable rough hands that she had watched build fence and doctor cattle and do 100 tasks with quiet competence. "That's a particular kind of grief," she said. "The muscle memory kind." "Yeah," he lifted his eyes to hers. "It gets easier." "I know," she said. "That's what frightens me a little, because easier feels like forgetting." "It's not forgetting," he said, with a certainty that suggested he had already traveled this road and come out the other side. "It's just carrying it differently. You find better ways to carry it." She looked at him in the lamplight, this solitary and careful man who had built walls around himself with the same methodical competence with which he built everything else, and she saw, clearly and without any pretense between them, that he was in the process of deciding whether to take those walls down. She could see the decision happening in his face like weather. She reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly, just for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He turned his hand under hers so that his palm faced up and his fingers closed around hers for the span of about 3 heartbeats. Then he let go and cleared his throat and stood up to pour himself coffee, and neither of them said anything else about it, but the whole kitchen felt different after that. Warmer somehow than the stove could account for. February brought a thaw, then a second freeze worse than the first, which Pete Garrity said was entirely characteristic of Wyoming and entirely unfair. Charlotte agreed on both counts. Pete was fully recovered from his January fever, and making up for his time of helplessness with a cheerfulness that filled the bunkhouse, and occasionally the main house, with the sound of him humming ballads of uncertain geographic origin. It was during the second freeze that Monroe's horse threw a shoe on the south pasture, and Monroe came home on foot, having led the horse back carefully across 2 miles of icy ground, and arrived at the house with his boots soaked through, and his expression carrying the particular brand of exhaustion that followed a situation that could have been much worse, and you knew it. Charlotte had the boots off him before he'd finished explaining what happened. She put them by the stove to dry. She put dry socks in front of him, which she had located in his bureau drawer in a manner that had required exactly 0 embarrassment, because she was the housekeeper, and it was her job to know where things were. She put a bowl of soup in front of him and a piece of cornbread beside it. He sat at the kitchen table in his stocking feet looking at the soup, and then looking at her, and then looking back at the soup with the expression of a man who was confronting something he wasn't sure he had words for. "You don't have to do all this," he said. "Somebody has to," she said, sitting down across from him. "Charlotte," he said, and the use of her given name, which he had never used before, made her still. She looked at him. "I want to be honest with you," he said in the careful voice of a man choosing each word like he was choosing where to step in uncertain terrain. "I think you know already that I'm not a man who says things easily. My father was the same way. We're built of silences, the Haskins men." "I've noticed," she said, equally careful. "I've been trying to figure out." He stopped, started again. "When Elias Pudge sent you out here, I thought you'd be gone in a week. Most people who come out here from back east don't have any understanding of what this life actually is. And you haven't been what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone temporary," he said. He looked at her steadily. "You don't seem temporary to me anymore." The kitchen was very quiet. The wind outside had died for once, and the only sound was the settling of the fire in the stove. "I'm not temporary," Charlotte said. "I never was." Monroe Haskins took a long breath. "I'd like to take you to Harlan Creek on Saturday," he said, "to the Calhoun's dinner. Grace Calhoun holds a supper the second Saturday of February every year. It's the main social event of the season, which I understand is not saying much," but he stopped. The tips of his ears had gone slightly red in the way she had observed happen when he was embarrassed. "I'd like to take you, not as my housekeeper, as the other thing." "The other thing," she repeated, and she was smiling now in a way she didn't try to contain. His jaw tightened. "You're going to make me say it." "I really am," she agreed. "As the woman I'd like to court," he said, looking directly at her with those gray-green eyes that she had spent 3 months learning to read. "If you're agreeable." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She thought about St. Louis and the boarding house and the advertisement in the Missouri Gazette and the stagecoach and 11 days of travel and Elias Pudge's face and the 4-mile walk through the snow. She thought about the kitchen table and the lamplight and the cup of tea and his hand turning over under hers. "I'm agreeable," she said. The Calhoun supper was held in the largest room of the Calhoun house, which was the grandest structure in Harlan Creek, and which Grace Calhoun kept in a state of polished readiness for exactly this kind of occasion. There were perhaps 30 people present, which was a significant portion of the permanent population of the surrounding area, ranchers and farmers and their wives and a few townspeople, crowded together with the particular warmth of people who had all survived the same winter together and were glad to be briefly indoors. Monroe Haskins arriving at the Calhoun supper with a woman on his arm produced a visible ripple of interest. Charlotte felt it the moment they walked in, the shift in attention, the whispered remarks that started at the edges of the room and worked their way toward the center. Monroe's hand was at the small of her back, steady and deliberate, and she thought that this was a man who, once he decided something, committed to it without equivocation. Grace Calhoun herself was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 50 who had the social intelligence of a diplomat and the warmth of a good fire. She shook Charlotte's hand and looked her over with the frank assessment of someone who had been sorting the genuine from the pretense for decades, and apparently found Charlotte to be of the former category, because her expression shifted from evaluation to genuine welcome. "I heard you walked 4 miles from town in the first snow of the season to ask Monroe for work," she said. "I did," Charlotte said. "Good," Grace said. "We need women out here with that kind of gumption. Lord knows the country doesn't give you the easy version." They were seated together at the long table, Monroe and Charlotte, and she found herself speaking across him to a rancher named Elias Webb who had a question about teaching methods, apparently still hoping the school situation would sort itself out, and then speaking down the table to Grace's daughter, Lily, about the particular difficulty of bread making in high altitude and cold kitchens. And Monroe watched her navigate the room with the contained pleasure of a man watching something he had been quietly hoping for come true. On the sleigh ride back to the Rafter H, wrapped in a heavy blanket against the clear, cold night, the moon bright on the snow and the horse's breath making steady silver clouds. Monroe put his arm around her and she let herself lean into the warmth of him, and they didn't say much, because there are kinds of contentment that don't need language. "I told Elias Webb that you'd be the better choice for the school if Benson Fitch's drinking got worse," Monroe said. Charlotte looked up at him. "Did you?" He seemed interested. He paused. "I know that's what you came here to do. I didn't want you to think. I don't want to be something that stands between you and what you want." She studied his profile in the moonlight, the straight nose and the strong jaw and the careful way he carried himself even now, even with his arm around her. "What I want," she said slowly, "has gotten considerably more complicated since November." He looked down at her, and in the moonlight his expression was open in a way she had not seen before, unguarded, the walls all the way down. "For me too," he said. He kissed her that night, standing on the porch of the Rafter H with the moon overhead and the snow blue-white around them. A careful, deliberate kiss that asked a question and waited for the answer. And she gave the answer plainly and without hesitation, because Charlotte Doyle did not believe in ambiguity when clarity was available. March came in with the temperature still brutal but the days lengthening. A quarter-hour more of light each day, enough to make a difference when you were watching for it. The nights were still deep cold, but there were afternoons where the sun hit the south-facing slope of the barn roof, and you could hear the first tentative dripping of snowmelt. And every rancher in the territory lifted their head at that sound the way you lift your head when you hear music starting at a distance. Monroe and Charlotte had settled into a new pattern, one that was the same as before in all its outward structure, but entirely different in its interior weather. He still worked from before dawn to after dark. She still kept the house and cooked supper. Pete and Cy still ate at the long table and provided the soundtrack of the evenings with Pete's songs and Cy's card games. But now there was the hand he found on the back of her chair when he came in from outside. Now there was the way she looked up when she heard his boots on the porch steps, not because she was listening, but because her whole body had learned the particular cadence of him. Now there was the half hour after Pete and Cy went back to the bunkhouse when the kitchen was quiet and the fire was low, and they sat beside each other rather than across from each other, and talked about everything from the price of cattle to what they had believed about the world when they were children. She learned that Monroe had been briefly engaged at 26 to a woman from Cheyenne who had come to visit the Rafter H and decided within a week that she wanted nothing to do with this life. He told it without bitterness, just as information, but Charlotte heard in the spare telling of it the shape of the wound, and she understood, suddenly and completely, all his wariness, all the walls. She told him about St. Louis, about the years nursing her mother through a slow illness, about the way grief could become the organizing principle of a life until you had to consciously work to build something else. What would you build? He asked her once late in March when the thaw was beginning to make itself felt in earnest. If you could build anything, she thought about it. The fire was burning low and the kitchen was shadowed and warm, and she could hear the wind outside doing something gentler than it had been doing all winter, a softer sound, more suggestion than assault. "A school," she said, "somewhere useful," and she paused. And he said, "A home," she said, "the real kind, not a boarding house or a temporary situation. A place that's mine." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "This place could be yours." She looked at him. "If you wanted it," he said. "If you wanted to stay." A pause. "With me." Charlotte Doyle had not spent 3 months in a Wyoming winter learning to be careless with important things. She looked at Monroe Haskins, this careful, silent, deeply feeling man who had somehow become the most essential landscape of her daily life, and she thought, yes, with a sureness that went all the way down. "Are you proposing to me?" she said. "I'm working up to it," he said, with the ghost of that almost smile that was really a full smile when you knew how to read it. "Take your time," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her steadily. "You could have been, though. You could have left in November and found something else, gone somewhere easier. Any reasonable person would have." "I'm not a reasonable person," she said. "I'm a person who walked 4 miles through November snow to ask a stranger for a job. Reasonable wasn't in the description." He laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind she'd only heard a handful of times, which made it precious every time. He reached over and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with the gentleness of a man being careful with something irreplaceable, and she leaned into his hand. "Will you marry me, Charlotte Doyle?" he said. The first sound of snowmelt dripping from the eaves was just barely audible through the kitchen window, a thin, tentative music. "Yes," she said. The actual proposal, she would later tell Francis in a long and detailed letter, was both completely like him and completely unlike anything she had expected, which was the most accurate description of Monroe Haskins she had ever produced. The thaw came properly in early April. The snow retreated from the low ground first, leaving behind a landscape of incredible mud, and the vivid green of grass coming back after months of burial, urgent and determined as something that had been held under and was finally allowed to surface. The cottonwood trees along the creek put out their first pale leaves. The horses in the corrals picked up their heads and looked at the sky with a different quality of attention, sensing the change. Pete Garrity observed one morning over breakfast that winter was what separated the real Wyomingites from the pretenders, which he delivered with a meaningful look in Charlotte's direction. "You're still here," he said to her, in a tone that managed to be both a statement of fact and a toast. "I am," she said. "I told Cy in November you'd be gone by Christmas," Pete said, with the cheerfulness of a man confessing a failure in a sport he hadn't expected to lose. "I owe him $1. Charlotte set a plate of biscuits in front of him. "Pay your debts, Pete." Monroe was smiling at the end of the table, that quiet, full smile she'd learned to see in him. The wedding was held on a Saturday in the second week of May, which was the soonest that the roads were reliable enough for the circuit preacher to make it out to the Rafter H. It was not a large event because there was no means to make it one, but Grace Calhoun came with her daughter Lily and her husband Frank, and Elias Webb came with his wife Sarah, and even Elias Pudge came from the general store, looking uncomfortable in a good coat and carrying a wrapped package that turned out to contain a proper tea service of china, which Charlotte suspected he had ordered from a catalog sometime in March, and which she therefore found enormously touching. She wore her best dress, which was blue wool, and Grace Calhoun had brought wildflowers gathered from the hillside above her house, purple and yellow early mountain flowers that only bloomed for a short time after the snow left. Charlotte carried them in a simple bunch tied with a piece of ribbon, and she walked out onto the porch of the Rafter H into the May sunshine, and Monroe Haskins was standing there waiting for her. He had put on his good coat and a clean white shirt and had actually cut his hair, which Cy Walsh had apparently been recruited to assist with, the results of which were imperfect but earnest. He had shaved. He was turning his hat in his hands the way he turned his coffee cup when he was thinking, and when she came through the door and he saw her, he went perfectly still, and his face did the thing it did when he was containing something too large for ordinary expression. "You look beautiful," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it. "You look very handsome," she said, equally quiet. "Even the haircut." He made a sound that was mostly a laugh and offered her his arm, and she took it, and they stood before the circuit preacher in the Wyoming May sunshine with their friends around them, and the mountains in the distance still carrying winter on their high shoulders, even as the valley below them ran green and gold and alive. The preacher asked if they took each other, and they said yes, both of them, with a simplicity and certainty that needed no embellishment. Monroe produced a ring. It was his mother's ring, a slender gold band with a small river stone set in it that he'd had the jeweler in Laramie polish and reset. He put it on her finger with the careful hands that she loved, and she looked down at it and felt the whole length of the winter behind her and the whole length of everything ahead, and was glad. Pete Garrity sang at the reception. This was inevitable, and everyone accepted it. He sang well, actually, when the occasion moved him, which this one clearly did, because he produced a proper love ballad in a voice that Cy Walsh said his grandmother would have wept to hear. And there wasn't a dry eye among the women, and several of the men were looking very carefully at the mountains. Grace Calhoun brought a wedding cake, which she had made herself, a dense and beautiful spice cake with dried fruit, rich and dark and perfect. There was a toast with a bottle of good whiskey that Frank Calhoun had been saving. There was dancing on the wide porch boards, which had never been danced on before and creaked with the novelty. Monroe danced with Charlotte in the late afternoon sunshine with the mountains behind them and the green smell of spring everywhere, and he was not a graceful dancer, which she had already suspected, but he was a careful one, attentive to her, and that was better. "Happy," he said quietly while they were dancing. "Extraordinarily," she said. The summer was the first easy season Charlotte had known since before her mother's illness. The Rafter H in summer was a revelation after the brutal winter, the way the land expanded into itself, the meadows running with color, the cottonwoods full and shade-giving by the creek, the mountains high and clear against a sky so blue it seemed painted. The cattle got fat on summer grass. The horses had the loose-limbed ease of animals that had stopped bracing against the cold. Monroe taught Charlotte to ride properly, which she had known how to do in a basic sense since Indiana, but not with the confidence and balance that Wyoming required. They rode out together on summer evenings along the creek and through the meadows, and this became her favorite time of the day, the hour before supper when the light was golden and long and Monroe was beside her on his gray horse, and they talked about the ranch and about their lives and about nothing at all, and she thought, "I did not know it could be this simple." Happiness, she meant. She had not known it could be this available, that it was something you could find and hold and live inside of, rather than something you glimpsed from a distance. In August, Benson Fitch's drinking caught up with him in the way that had always been inevitable, and the school committee approached Charlotte through Elia's Webb with the teaching offer. She talked to Monroe about it that evening, sitting on the porch in the summer dark with the stars enormous overhead. "Do you want it?" he said. "Very much," she said honestly. "Then take it," he said without hesitation. "It would mean riding to town 4 days a week during the school term," she said, "which would change things here." "Pete and Cy and I managed before you came," he said. "We'll manage the domestic side, and you've taught me enough about the kitchen by now that we won't starve." He looked at her. "Charlotte, this is what you came west to do. Don't let anything stand between you and it, not even me." She looked at her husband in the star-bright dark, this man who had called himself built of silences and was still finding new ways to show her what he felt without using many words. "You are very decidedly not in my way," she said. She accepted the position. The school term started in September, and Charlotte Doyle Haskins stood in front of 14 children of varying ages in the small one-room schoolhouse in Harlan Creek and felt, for the first time since her mother died, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do. The children ranged from 6 to 14, and they were of wildly different abilities and backgrounds, some who had had some schooling before and some who had had none, and she treated them all with the same patient and systematic respect, which they responded to with the way children respond to any adult who takes them seriously, which is to say, with genuine effort. Monroe picked her up from school on Fridays because it was the longest day, and the ride home alone in the early dark was something she had been willing to do, but he was unwilling to allow. He waited for her with the horses at the school's hitching post, and she came out to find him there every Friday, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the street, and the sight of him waiting for her became something she carried through the week like a held warmth. Word came in October, in the form of a visit from a land agent named Gideon Cross, that the homesteading claims immediately north of the Rafter H were going to be surveyed and opened for settlement in the spring. Monroe explained to Charlotte over supper, with Pete and Cy leaning forward with interest, that this would bring new neighbors and potentially difficult questions about water rights and grazing access. The creek runs through that north section, Monroe said. If a homesteader dams it or diverts it, we lose the water access for the north pasture. Can you file a claim on it yourself? Charlotte asked. The Homestead Act limits claim size, Monroe said. I can't take all of it. Can I? She said. Monroe looked at her. Pete Garrity looked at Cy Walsh. Cy Walsh looked at his plate. A woman can file a homestead claim under her own name, Charlotte said, because she had read the statute during her months of school teaching, having made it her business to understand land law for exactly these kinds of situations. As a married woman, I can file separately from you on adjacent land. We could protect the water access and the north grazing corridor. The quiet around the table was the particular quiet of men who have just been presented with a solution they should have thought of themselves. She's right, Cy said to his plate. Monroe was looking at Charlotte with that expression she loved, the one that appeared when she had surprised him again. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. All right, he said. Charlotte filed the homestead claim on the north section in the spring of 1880, which required a trip to the land office in Laramie, which Monroe accompanied her on, and which turned into their first real time away from the ranch together. 2 nights in a proper hotel in Laramie with a dining room and electric lights, which were still a novelty in 1880, and which Charlotte found both impressive and slightly eerie compared to the honest warmth of oil lamps. They walked along the streets of Laramie in the March cold, and Monroe bought her a book from the bookshop because she had stopped in front of the window and looked at it. And she bought him a proper pair of good leather gloves from the leather goods store because she had been wanting him to have better ones since December of 1878. They had supper in the hotel dining room where Monroe wore his good coat and was very polite to the waiter in the careful way of a man who was not entirely comfortable with formal dining, but was determined to be adequate to the occasion. And she loved him so thoroughly in that moment that she had to look at her soup. The land claim was filed successfully, and the water access of the Rafter H North pasture was secured. On the road back to Harlan Creek, with the March sky a clean pale blue above them and the wagon moving through country that Charlotte now knew as well as she had ever known anything, Monroe reached over and took her hand on the seat between them and kept it. I want to tell you something, he said. Tell me, she said. The winter you came, he said. That first November when you knocked on the door. I told myself you'd be gone by spring. I told myself that out here alone, without the things a woman from back east was used to, you'd reconsider. I told myself the winter would change your mind. She looked at him, and you were still here when the thaw came, he said, and so was I standing right here. He paused. I think that was the point when I understood. She thought about November, the cold and the carpetbag and Elias Pudge's face and the 4-mile walk through the snow, and she thought about December and Christmas and the tree and his face in the firelight, and January and the frozen water trough and his hand turning under hers, and February and the cowhound supper and the sleigh ride home, and March and the first sound of snow melt through the kitchen window, and April and the spring mud and the green returning, and May and the wedding and the mountains still wearing their winter even as everything else changed. I was never going to leave, she said. I told you that. I know, he said. I know you did. I just needed to believe it, and I needed winter to show me whether it was true. She laced her fingers through his. Did winter satisfy you on the question? Completely, he said. They drove on through the March country, hand in hand, with the mountains ahead of them and the ranch waiting around the bend. The summer of 1880 was remarkable for several reasons. The North Section homestead was producing its first hay crop under Charlotte's management, which was a more involved enterprise than she had anticipated, but also more satisfying. The school term had ended in June with a proper closing examination that Charlotte had organized, which had drawn every parent in the district, and which Elias Webb declared to be the finest academic event Harlan Creek had ever hosted, which was probably true, given the competition. And Charlotte discovered in July that she was going to have a baby. She told Monroe on a Tuesday evening, In the kitchen, after supper, with the summer light still golden through the window and Pete and Cy safely in the bunkhouse. She said it plainly because plain was how she said important things, and she watched his face go through about 15 different expressions in approximately 2 seconds before it settled on something so open and unguarded and suffused with joy that she felt her eyes fill. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and wrapped her in his arms and held her with such careful, deliberate care, like she had become something fragile and extraordinary simultaneously, that she pressed her face into his shoulder and laughed. "Are you all right?" he said against the top of her head. "Are you feeling all right? You've been. I thought you seemed tired, but I didn't. How long have you?" "Monroe," she said, still laughing a little. "Right," he said. He stepped back just enough to look at her face, his hands on her shoulders. "Right, are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine," she said. "I'm very happy." "Good," he exhaled. "Good." He pulled her close again. "I'm Charlotte, He stopped at the edge of words too large for him. "I know," she said, and pressed her hand flat against his chest where his heart was beating too fast. "We'll need to get word to Dr. Crawford in Laramie," he said, against her hair. "He's the nearest physician who's worth the ride, and you'll need to stop some of the heavier work on the homestead. And we should—" "Monroe," she said. "Yes." "Stop managing it for a minute and just be happy." He was quiet for a moment, then his arms tightened around her. "I am," he said. "I am happy. I've been happy since April of '79. I'm just still not very good at being it quietly." "That's not true," she said. "You're very good at being happy quietly. The rest of it you just need to practice." He pressed his lips to her hair. "I'll practice." Pete Garrity and Cy Walsh received the news the next morning at breakfast, with expressions of profound masculine emotion that they were both clearly uncertain how to navigate. Pete recovered first and demanded to know if he and Cy could serve as honorary uncles, which Monroe said was up to Charlotte, and Charlotte said yes, which made Pete beam with such genuine joy that even Cy, who was habitually reserved about showing feeling, had to look out the window for a moment. The autumn was full and golden, the best season Charlotte had yet experienced in Wyoming, the aspens turning gold against the blue sky, and the air having that particular clarity of high-altitude fall, dry and bright and tasting of something impossibly clean. She rode less as the months went on and her body changed, and Monroe was meticulous about what she lifted and how far she walked on bad ground without help, which Charlotte found both touching and occasionally exasperating. "I'm with child," she told him one afternoon when he reached to take a bucket from her that she was perfectly capable of carrying. "I'm not made of glass." "I know you're not made of glass," he said, taking the bucket anyway. "You're made of something considerably tougher." "But I'm going to carry that bucket." She looked at him, he looked at her, he carried the bucket. "Doctor." Crawford came from Laramie in late January of 1881, which was earlier than necessary, but Monroe had written him in October and arranged for him to winter relatively close by, at the Webb's place, where he had a patient with a chronic respiratory condition. This was not a coincidence. This was Monroe Haskins managing every variable within his considerable managerial reach. Their son was born on the 4th of February, 1881, in the bedroom of the Rafter H house, during a snowstorm that was, Charlotte later said, entirely appropriate given the circumstances under which she had arrived in Wyoming. Monroe was downstairs during the labor, which was Dr. Crawford's and Grace Calhoun's efficient instruction, and which he obeyed only because Grace Calhoun's instruction was a force of nature that didn't leave room for negotiation, and he wore a track in the kitchen floor that Pete and Cy, who were also downstairs, observed with a kind of awestruck silence. When Dr. Crawford called him upstairs, Monroe Haskins went up those stairs faster than he had ever moved in his life, and came into the bedroom to find Charlotte sitting up against the pillows with their son in her arms, flushed and exhausted, and looking at the baby with an expression of wonderstruck tenderness, and the sight of it broke him open so completely that he sat down on the edge of the bed and put his face in his hands. "Monroe," Charlotte said softly. He looked up. His eyes were wet and he made no effort to hide it. She held the baby out to him. He took his son with hands that shook slightly and held him with the same careful, deliberate care with which he held everything important, and looked down at this small new person who had his chin, Charlotte said, and her eyes, Monroe said, and probably Pete Garrity's general opinion of his own importance, Cy Walsh would say later, making everyone laugh. "What do we call him?" Monroe said. Charlotte had thought about this for a long time. "James," she said, "for your father." Monroe looked at her over the top of their son's head, and the thing in his face at that was so complete, so entire, that Charlotte felt it the way you feel weather change, in every part of you. "James Thomas Haskins," Monroe said. "Thomas was his middle name." "I know," Charlotte said. "You told me." He looked at her. "I don't remember telling you that." "November of '79, she said. "You were talking about the Rafter H history, how your father built it, and you said James Thomas Haskins started with 6 head of cattle and a borrowed wagon. You've told me more than you think you have." Monroe looked at her for a long time with James Thomas Haskins the younger in his arms, tiny and pink and phenomenally opinionated about being awake in a cold world. "I love you," Monroe said. He said it the way he said everything important, directly and without cushioning, just the plain truth of it. "I know," she said, then. "I love you too. I've loved you since somewhere around the fence line conversation." "December," he said. "December," she confirmed. Outside, the snow was falling over the Rafter H, over the barn and the corrals and the cottonwood trees and the north section homestead and the creek that ran through all of it, over the mountains to the northwest that had presided over all of this without comment, impartial as God. Spring came again, as it always did, with the same urgent insistence on returning. James Haskins grew from a February baby into a spring baby and then into a summer baby, each week of him remarkable and unrepeatable, and Monroe watched his son the way he watched everything that mattered, with steady, attentive care. He was, as it turned out, a natural father, which surprised Pete and Cy and did not surprise Charlotte in the least, because she had always known that the capacity for tenderness was there in him, immense and carefully held, waiting for the right place to be put. Pete Garrity became the baby's devoted champion, which everyone had predicted and which went even further than anyone had quite imagined. He produced a rattle from somewhere, a proper painted wooden one, and sat on the porch rocking James in his arms while singing Irish songs with an earnestness that made Charlotte press her hand over her mouth to contain her smile. Cy Walsh was quieter about it, as he was quiet about most things, but when Charlotte came into the kitchen one morning in July and found Cy sitting at the table with James propped against his knee making faces at him and James responding with the grave attentiveness of a baby who has not yet learned that faces are funny, she stood in the doorway for a long moment and thought that this was what the word home actually meant, not a structure but an accumulation of moments like this one. In August, there was a letter from Frances in St. Louis. Her old friend was engaged to a lawyer named Herbert and asked Charlotte to describe what it felt like when you knew. Charlotte wrote back a letter that was possibly the most honest thing she had ever put on paper, about November snow and a kitchen table and lamplight and a hand turning under hers, and about the spring coming after the winter and finding you still standing where you had decided to stand, and it being enough, and more than enough, and everything. The school term started again in September, and Charlotte returned to her 4 days a week in Harlan Creek, with James in the care of Grace Calhoun, who had appointed herself the baby's godmother with the confidence of a woman who did not ask permission for her decisions. Grace and James had taken to each other immediately in the way of very old and very new people, both of whom have been relieved of certain social obligations and can afford to be direct. Monroe picked her up from school on Fridays still, with James now bundled up and riding with him in the wagon seat, and Charlotte would come out of the schoolhouse on Friday afternoons to find the two of them waiting for her, Monroe with his hat against the autumn sky, and James with his father's gray-green eyes looking at the world with an expression of acute interest. She would walk toward them across the street, and Monroe would watch her come, the way he had always watched her, with the full attention of a man who knows what it means to almost have missed something and did not. One Friday in October, with the aspens gold and the air cold and clean, and the whole world in the process of its annual acknowledgement that winter was coming, Monroe helped her up to the wagon seat, and James immediately grabbed her finger with both hands in the proprietary way he had, and Monroe settled the blanket around them both. And as he did, he said, low and close to her ear, "Elias Webb told me today that the school committee wants to talk about building you a proper two-room schoolhouse in the spring." Charlotte looked at him. 2 rooms, one for the younger children, one for the older ones. He said enrollment is up because the homesteaders who came in on the north section have children, and they've been walking their children 3 miles to your school, and they want to do more for it. She sat with that for a moment. A proper two-room schoolhouse. The thought of it opened up in her like the first warm day after a long winter. "I'd need an assistant," she said, already thinking about it. "Webb mentioned that too," Monroe said, climbing up to his side and taking the reins. "He suggested Lily Calhoun, Grace's daughter. Apparently Lily has been wanting to teach since she was 12, and Grace has been holding her back from it." "Lily would be wonderful," Charlotte said. Monroe clicked to the horses, and the wagon moved forward down the street of Harlan Creek, and James made a sound of contentment against Charlotte's shoulder, and the mountains ahead of them were turning lavender in the long October light. "Monroe," Charlotte said. He said, his attention on the road. "Thank you," she said. He glanced at her. "For what?" She thought about how to answer that, which deserved more than the short version. She thought about the door opening and a man who hadn't expected her. She thought about every act of quiet care, the wood stacked by the kitchen door and the lined gloves and the soup left hot on the back of the stove and Dr. Crawford wintering nearby and the ring that had been his mother's and a dozen other things too small to name individually but enormous in their accumulation. "For opening the door," she said. "Back in November, you could have sent me away." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the road ahead. The mountains were closer now, and the light was turning gold around their edges. "I thought about it," he admitted. "I know. And then you said you'd walked 4 miles and you needed somewhere to sleep," and he paused. "And you didn't look afraid. You looked determined, and I thought." He stopped again. "What did you think?" she said. He looked at her sidelong, with the smile that had started as an almost smile, and was now entirely full and entirely his and entirely for her. "I thought I'd better not be the thing that defeats her," he said. Charlotte laughed, clear and free in the autumn air. James startled and then looked up at her with the expression of someone deciding how to feel about being startled, and she kissed the top of his head and felt Monroe's hand find hers on the blanket and hold it. The winter of 1881 came on its usual schedule, which was earlier than anyone wanted and harder than anyone was ever quite ready for. But the Rafter H was as prepared for it as a ranch could be, the hay laid in, the fences reinforced with Monroe's stone-based posts that had held 2 winters now without incident, the bunkhouse snug and well-stocked, the main house warm with the new stove Monroe had installed before November. James Haskins approached his first real winter with the philosophical acceptance of a baby who has not yet learned that cold is unusual. He sat on the kitchen floor in his woolens and watched the snow through the window with enormous interest and reached for the frost patterns on the glass with the expression of a naturalist making notes. Charlotte stood in the kitchen doorway watching him, her coffee cup warm in her hands, and Monroe came in from outside with snow on his coat and cold in his face and stopped when he saw her expression. "What are you looking at?" he said. "Both of you," she said, because she could see his reflection in the window glass too, his reflection and James on the floor below it, 2 versions of the same face looking at the same winter from different distances. Monroe came to stand behind her, putting one arm around her from behind, still cold from outside, and pressed his lips to her temple. "You know what Pete said this morning," he said. "What did Pete say?" "He said he thinks we need another one." Another baby. He said James needs someone to argue with. Charlotte turned her head to look at him. Pete said that. He did, at some length he had opinions. She looked back at James, who was now attempting to eat the frost pattern off the window glass with the purposeful ambition of very small children. Pete isn't wrong, she said. She felt Monroe smile against her temple. No, he said. He's usually not. The months passed and gathered into one another the way months do, each one full and particular, winter giving way to spring and spring to summer and summer to fall with the reliable drama of Wyoming country. Charlotte taught her school. Monroe ran his ranch. Pete sang and Cy worked, and James Haskins grew from a baby into a toddler, and then into a small determined person with his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and the combined charm of both. The two-room schoolhouse was built in the spring of 1882, as promised, and Lily Calhoun joined Charlotte as her teaching assistant with an energy and aptitude that confirmed everything Charlotte had suspected about her. Lily was 22 and fierce about education in the way of people who had been made to wait for the thing they loved, and the children responded to her the way children respond to people who are genuinely enthusiastic about something, which is to say, with their complete attention. Grace Calhoun at the opening of the new schoolhouse stood in the back of the room and watched her daughter teach and looked, for the first time Charlotte could remember, as if she had been surprised into being proud of something she hadn't known to expect. Monroe Haskins shook Elias Webb's hand that day with the contained warmth of a man who had invested in something and seen the return. Then he found Charlotte across the room and looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she thought, as she had thought on their wedding day, and on the morning James was born, and on a dozen ordinary days between, that she was the luckiest woman in the Wyoming territory. In June of 1882, Charlotte told Monroe she was expecting again, and he did not pace the kitchen floor this time. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and took both her hands in his and looked at her with the simple, full happiness of a man who had found the life he was meant to be living and knew it. "Are you happy?" he said. "Endlessly," she said. Their second child, a girl, was born in January of 1883, also during a snowstorm, because, as Charlotte told Monroe, their children were apparently Wyoming children to the bone and had strong opinions about entering the world during weather. They named her Margaret Rose, the Rose being for Charlotte's mother whose middle name it had been, and Margaret Rose Haskins arrived with an opinion about everything, and a set of lungs that demonstrated the opinion at length, and a head of dark hair that was entirely Monroe's. Pete Garrity held her for approximately 40 seconds before declaring her perfect, which was faster than he had declared James perfect, James having taken nearly 2 minutes. Cy Walsh held her more carefully, with the concentration of someone who was afraid of doing it wrong, and then something eased in his face, and he looked down at her with a smile so rare and genuine that Charlotte memorized it. James Haskins, at 2 years old, regarded his sister with the grave suspicion of someone who has been given information that has not yet been fully processed. Then she grabbed his finger, the way James himself had grabbed Charlotte's finger in the wagon, and James's face shifted into something wondering and proprietary simultaneously, and Charlotte thought, "There it is. There's the beginning of the thing." Monroe stood at the window that evening, the winter night beyond it thick with snow, Margaret Rose asleep against his chest and James asleep on the bed behind them and Charlotte watching from the doorway, and he looked out at the dark and the falling snow with the expression of a man taking account of his life. He turned and saw her watching him. "Come here," he said softly, not to wake the baby. She came to stand beside him at the window, and he shifted Margaret to one arm and put the other around Charlotte, and they stood together at the window of the Rafter H house looking out at the Wyoming winter, this impossible, beautiful, brutal country that had made them and kept them, this life they had built out of a November snowfall and a knocked door, and a woman who had refused to be defeated by circumstances, and a man who had decided not to be the thing that defeated her. I think about that first winter a lot, Monroe said, his voice low. So do I, Charlotte said. I was so certain you'd leave. I know you were. And every day you didn't, and every day after that. He paused. I kept waiting for you to realize. Realize what? She said. That it was too hard, he said. That this life was too hard, that I was too. He stopped. I'm not easy to know. No, she agreed, but you're worth knowing. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and Margaret Rose made a small sound in her sleep, and outside the snow fell over the rafter H and over the North Section homestead, and over the school in Harlan Creek and over Pete Garrity's bunkhouse where he was certainly singing something, and over the mountains that had watched all of this without comment and would go on watching, patient as stone. Next winter, Monroe said, I'll still be here. Next winter, Charlotte said. So will I. They stood there, the two of them, while the snow came down outside and the children slept and the ranch breathed slowly in the cold, and the fire burned warm and steady behind them, and the life they had made lay all around them, finished and full and entirely theirs. It had started with a November knock on a door and a 4-mile walk through the snow and a man who had told himself she'd be gone by spring and a woman who had told herself she had nowhere to be gone to. And somewhere between those two starting places they had found the thing that neither of them had known to look for, the thing that was there when the thaw came and was still there after, and the thing that would be there through every winter after this one, steady as the mountains, warm as the fire, certain as the spring. The rafter H in the late evening with the snow falling and the fire burning, and the children sleeping and Monroe Haskins with his arm around Charlotte Doyle Haskins at the window, was a picture that needed no embellishment and no addition, because it was already complete, because it had always been moving toward this, from the very first step of a cold November road. And outside, the snow came down, and inside they were warm.